There are nights when silence screams louder than words ever could. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the sudden cough from the neighbor next door, these sounds filled the space between us, a distance I could no longer ignore. As I stared at her, sitting there on the couch with her face buried in her phone, my heart sank. It was the same thing every night now, an endless cycle of excuses, promises that never came to life, and a growing emptiness that spread like a silent disease between us. The first time she said it, I had shrugged it off. "I'm just too tired for a date night tonight," she had told me. I believed her. I thought maybe she had just had a long day at work. I had understood. But as the weeks went by, I began to notice something strange. The tiredness was only ever present when it came to spending time with me. She'd lay on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, telling me she couldn't muster up the energy to do anything. Until, of course, she received a text, a call, or a sudden urge to step outside. "Maybe I just need some time alone," she'd said once, offering me an apologetic smile. But I knew better. That was just the surface, the mask she wore to keep me at arm's length. Tonight, it happened again. The same pattern. I had made dinner, her favorite, no less, and asked if she wanted to spend the evening together. A movie. A glass of wine. Just us. But she had declined, just like all the other times before. "I'm too tired," she said, her voice soft but final, as though that should explain everything. But I wasn't fooled. I had begun to notice the small things, the way she'd smile when texting someone, the way her phone lit up with notifications at odd hours of the night, how she seemed to perk up when someone called or messaged her. I watched her, sitting there with that tired, vacant expression, her fingers scrolling lazily across her screen. She didn't even seem to notice my eyes on her. "Maybe you should just go to bed early tonight," I suggested, trying to keep my tone casual. I didn't want to confront her, not yet. I wasn't ready for that conversation, but the words had already begun to form in my mind. "I'll be fine," she replied, her gaze never leaving her phone. "You go ahead and do whatever you want." And so, I did. I went to the bedroom, pretending to be okay with it. But as I lay there, the minutes ticking by, something gnawed at me. I wasn't okay with it. Not anymore. There was something wrong. Something beneath the surface that I couldn't ignore any longer. When we had first met, everything had been easy. Date nights, spontaneous road trips, dinners at odd hours just because we could. We had been those people, the ones others envied, the ones who made it look effortless. But somewhere along the way, I began to lose her. And the more I reached out, the further she pulled away. The excuses started to pile up. She was too busy at work, too tired after her early mornings, too stressed with all the demands of life. It had all made sense, at first. We all go through phases like that. But the more time passed, the less believable it became. I started paying attention to the small inconsistencies, the way she'd linger in the shower longer than usual, the way she'd change the subject when I asked about her day. It all seemed so calculated. But tonight, something felt different. I could feel it in the air, the thick tension that hung between us. I wasn't sure why it had hit me so hard, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something that had been slowly building over time had finally come to a head. I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself I was overthinking things. But deep down, I knew. There was only so much pretending I could do. I couldn't sleep. The ticking of the clock was too loud in the silence of our bedroom. I tossed and turned, but every time I closed my eyes, my thoughts turned back to her. What was going on? Why was she lying to me? I wasn't sure when it had started, this creeping suspicion, but now that it was there, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I finally couldn't take it anymore. I got up, my mind racing. The only way I'd ever know the truth was if I faced it head-on. I had to know if there was someone else. If she had been hiding something from me all along. I opened the bedroom door softly, careful not to wake her, and stepped into the hallway. The sound of her voice came faintly from the living room, muffled by the walls between us. It sounded like she was talking to someone. But who? I crept toward the living room, curiosity mingled with dread. I peered around the corner, my heart pounding in my chest. She was laughing. But it wasn't the tired, drained laugh I had come to expect in the last few weeks. It was light, full of energy, like she was talking to someone she hadn't seen in a long time. And then I heard it, the name. The name I didn't recognize. "Yeah, we can grab dinner next weekend," she said. "It'll be fun to catch up." I felt a cold rush of panic sweep through me. Who was she talking to? Why hadn't she told me about this person? I stood there in the darkness, my mind spinning with questions. And then it hit me. She wasn't too tired for someone else. She wasn't too tired for him. The realization stung like ice in my veins. I had suspected it before, but hearing the words spoken out loud, the confirmation that I wasn't enough anymore, that someone else had filled the space I used to occupy, it shattered something inside me. My heart had already been cracked open, but this was the truth. I wanted to confront her, to ask her who he was, why she'd lied, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. I needed to gather myself, to figure out how to approach this without falling apart. Because I knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. I retreated to the bedroom, my mind swirling with everything I had just heard. I climbed back into bed, pulling the covers around me, but sleep didn't come. All I could think about was her smile, the one she had saved for him, the way she had been glowing during their conversation. All the things she had said, all the things she had kept hidden from me. I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that flooded my chest. And in that moment, I realized that the life we had built together was no longer real. It was a lie, built on promises and shared moments that had slowly withered away into nothing. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with all of this. But one thing was certain, I couldn't go back to pretending. The truth was out, and now, I had to face it. Tomorrow, I would confront her. I wasn't sure how, or when, but I couldn't keep living in the shadow of this lie. I had to know what had really been going on, and what, if anything, was left for us. But for now, I lay there in the darkness, my heart heavy with the weight of the truth I had uncovered. I wasn't sure where it would lead, but I knew one thing, it was the beginning of the end. The silence between us the next morning was deafening. As I sat at the breakfast table, pushing my toast around with a fork, the hum of the coffee machine seemed louder than usual. It was a ritual I had come to love, a simple routine that felt comforting, like the steady beat of a heart. But today, it was all hollow. Every sip of coffee, every bite of food, felt like I was just going through the motions. She had already gotten up before me, showered, and dressed, but hadn't said a word. I hadn't expected her to. There was a strange tension in the air, something unspoken, something I couldn't quite name. I had barely slept, my mind churning with everything I had learned the night before. She was still in denial, or perhaps too skilled at pretending everything was fine. But I couldn't pretend. Not anymore. My mind kept going back to her phone call, the way her voice had softened when she spoke to him. She hadn't told me about him, not once. Not even a mention of a new friend, a co-worker, or someone she was seeing. It was all hidden behind this carefully constructed wall of tiredness and stress. I felt like an idiot for not having noticed it earlier, for not having read between the lines sooner. She walked into the kitchen as I was finishing my coffee, and I could feel the moment shift. The weight of her presence was no longer comforting. It felt heavy, like an unspoken truth hanging in the air between us. She smiled at me, a small, nervous smile, but I didn't return it. I couldn't. "Good morning," she said, her voice tentative, like she was testing the waters. "Morning," I replied flatly, not meeting her eyes. I focused on my cup, unwilling to look at her just yet. Her eyes lingered on me for a moment, as if she was waiting for something, a sign that everything was still okay, that nothing had changed. But I couldn't give her that. I couldn't pretend that nothing had shifted, that I hadn't heard what I had heard, seen what I had seen. She must have realized it too, because the smile on her face faltered. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice a little too casual, too forced. I didn't answer immediately. I couldn't. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the words felt like they were lodged in my throat. What could I say? Could I really confront her now? Could I say, I know about him, and watch everything we had built come crashing down? But she needed to know. The truth was already out there, swirling in the space between us, and I couldn't keep living in this lie. "I'm fine," I muttered, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. "Just tired." She nodded, accepting the answer without question. But I saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Okay," she said, though there was a hint of hesitation. She moved to the sink, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were avoiding my gaze. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal, that we were still in sync. I had to ask her about it, ask her about him. But when I opened my mouth to speak, the words didn't come out. I closed my eyes and exhaled sharply, a deep frustration building in my chest. Why was this so hard? Why was I so afraid of what might happen when I confronted her? The truth was already staring me in the face. I didn't need to ask her about the other man. I already knew. But asking her about it meant facing the truth, and the truth felt like a tidal wave, threatening to drown me. Work was an escape. At least, That's what I tried to convince myself as I went through the motions of the day. I buried myself in spreadsheets, meetings, and emails, anything that would distract me from the gnawing sense of unease that followed me everywhere. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, my thoughts kept drifting back to her. It wasn't just the phone call anymore. It was everything, the way she'd been pulling away over the past few months, the way her laughter sounded hollow when it was directed at me, the way her eyes seemed distant when we were together. The signs had been there all along, hadn't they? I had just refused to see them. I was trying to tell myself that I was overreacting, that I was just reading too much into it, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something had shifted. I wasn't enough for her anymore. And the worst part? She was hiding it from me, keeping this secret that I wasn't allowed to know. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to confront her and demand the truth. But there was a strange kind of numbness that had settled inside me, a feeling of emptiness that was both terrifying and comforting. Because if I didn't know, if I didn't confront her, I could keep pretending. I could keep hoping that things would go back to the way they used to be. But I couldn't live in denial forever. By the time I made it home that evening, the house felt colder than before. The silence greeted me at the door, heavier now than it had been in the morning. I had known something was wrong, but now, the weight of it pressed down on me with an intensity that was hard to bear. She was already home, sitting in the living room. Her head was buried in her phone again, as usual. The same routine, the same distance between us. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her, trying to figure out how to move forward. Part of me wanted to give up, to walk away from it all and save myself the heartache. But the other part of me, the part that still cared for her, the part that still loved her, wanted to fight for us. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and walked toward her. "Hey," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside me. "Can we talk?" She didn't look up at first, but I saw the way her fingers paused on the screen of her phone. She knew this wasn't just a casual conversation. "About what?" she asked, her voice casual, almost dismissive. "About you," I said, my words sharper than I meant them to be. But the anger that had been building inside me all day started to seep through. I couldn't stop it. She put her phone down finally, her eyes meeting mine for the first time that evening. There was a flicker of guilt there, but she quickly masked it with a calm expression. "What's going on, really?" I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I don't believe you anymore. I don't believe your excuses. You've been pulling away from me, and I need to know why. What's happening? Who's the guy you've been talking to?" Her face paled, and I saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she stood up slowly, backing away from me. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, but there was no conviction in her voice. It was all too rehearsed. I shook my head. "You're lying. I heard you last night. You're not fooling me anymore." For a moment, the room was silent. Then, in the space where the truth should have been, she spoke. I didn't mean for it to happen," she said quietly, as if she was speaking to herself more than to me. "I didn't want it to get this far." And just like that, the truth began to spill out. She didn't meet my eyes as she spoke, and her voice trembled with uncertainty. There was no denying it now, she was caught in a web of her own making, and I was standing at the center of it, waiting for the truth to come spilling out. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she repeated, her hands fidgeting in front of her. "I didn't want to hurt you. But I've been feeling so distant lately, like I was losing myself. And then he came along, and everything felt different. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible." Her voice cracked as she spoke the last word, and I felt a pang of something deep within me, regret, maybe, or guilt for not having seen the cracks forming in her soul. I stayed quiet, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to demand to know why she had let it go this far. But another part of me understood. I could see it in her eyes now, the desperation, the fear. She wasn't just betraying me, she was betraying herself too. And maybe, in some twisted way, that was the hardest part. "You don't get it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I felt so trapped. In this life, in this relationship, I just couldn't breathe anymore. And when I met him, it was like a breath of fresh air. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. But it did. She paused, a long, heavy silence stretching between us. "I didn't want to hurt you, Matthew. I didn't know what else to do." I felt my chest tighten, as though the air in the room had suddenly become too thick to breathe. It was hard to even think straight. She wasn't looking for forgiveness, I knew that. She wasn't expecting me to tell her it was okay. But part of me, some foolish, hopeful part, wanted to believe that it could be fixed. That we could fix this. That we could find a way back to each other. But the reality was sinking in. The relationship we had once had, the connection we shared, had become a hollow shell. I had been blind to it. She had been slipping away long before he came into the picture, and by the time he showed up, I was already too late. I took a step back, my hands shaking, but I refused to let her see it. I was angry, yes, but mostly, I was just exhausted. And now? What happens now? I asked, my voice low. What do you want from me? What do you want from us? She hesitated, her gaze drifting to the floor. When she finally spoke, it was as though every word had been carefully considered, weighed with the burden of years of silence. I don't know, she admitted quietly. I don't know what I want anymore. The words hit me harder than I expected. I had feared this moment, the moment when everything we had built would come crashing down. But nothing could have prepared me for the hollow ache that followed her confession. I had always prided myself on being the kind of person who could fix things, who could find solutions, no matter how complicated the problem. But this was beyond my ability to solve. I couldn't fix her, and I couldn't fix us. I had spent so many nights trying to convince myself that things were fine, that the cracks we had developed were nothing more than temporary fissures, easily sealed with a few kind words and a little patience. But now I could see it clearly, the cracks were deep and they had been festering for far too long. I can't do this, I said, my voice breaking as I finally spoke the words I had been avoiding. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when you're doing this. When I'm just a part of the problem. She looked up at me then, her eyes brimming with tears. I didn't want it to end like this, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't want to hurt you. But I've been so lost, Matthew. And I just didn't know who to turn to. I shook my head, my heart hammering in my chest. I was right here. I was always right here. The anger was bubbling up again, mixing with a sense of betrayal that I couldn't quite suppress. But you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. You didn't trust me enough to talk about it. She flinched at my words, and for a moment, I regretted them. I could see how deeply she was hurting, how much she regretted what had happened, but the pain inside me, raw and jagged, was too fresh to ignore. I didn't know how to fix it, she whispered. I didn't know how to tell you. Maybe you didn't want to fix it, I shot back, my voice sharp and bitter. Maybe you just wanted an excuse. Maybe you wanted to feel something again, even if it meant tearing everything down. Her eyes widened, and she took a step toward me, but I held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. Don't. Just, don't. I could feel the tears welling in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not now. Not when I was finally seeing her for who she truly was in this moment, the person who had hidden so much from me, the person who had let me believe that everything was fine. I need space, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm inside. I need to figure this out. I need to figure out if this is something worth salvaging or if it's just over. She nodded, her face a mixture of guilt and sorrow, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to reach out, to apologize, to fix it. But it was too late for that. The damage had already been done. I turned and walked toward the door, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence between us. For the first time in a long time, the house felt empty. Not in the way it had before, when it was just the two of us, but in a way that was almost suffocating. As I reached the door, I heard her voice behind me, faint and desperate. Matthew, please. But I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The door closed softly behind me, and the weight of it pressed down on my chest. It wasn't just the end of our relationship. It was the end of everything I thought I knew about her, and about myself. The lies, the secrets, the lost trust, it all felt like a prison I couldn't escape from. And yet, as I stepped out into the night, I realized something. I didn't know who I was anymore, not without her. Not without this version of us that had been slowly disintegrating all along. But in that same moment, I knew I had to let go. For my own sake. And so, I did. The days that followed felt like a blur, like I was drifting through some thick fog, unable to see what lay ahead. I barely slept, barely ate. My thoughts consumed me, the noise in my head relentless, drowning out everything else. I went through the motions, forcing myself to go to work, to attend meetings, to keep up the facade of normalcy. But inside, I was a mess. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was her face, her smile, her hands trembling as she tried to explain what had happened. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to be furious, to feel that sharp, satisfying anger that would somehow give me clarity. But all I could feel was an overwhelming sadness. A sadness that washed over me like a tide, that crept into my bones and made it impossible to move forward. I couldn't even look at her anymore without feeling like I was staring at a stranger. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted with my whole heart, had become someone else entirely. She had changed, and so had I. The hardest part? The hardest part was the emptiness. The silence that lingered in the house, the absence of everything we had once shared. It felt like we were both just waiting for something to happen, for some magical solution to present itself, for some sign that we could fix this, that we could go back to the way things used to be. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. There was no going back. The damage had been done. But still, there was that part of me, the part that had loved her so deeply, that clung to hope. I wanted to believe that if we tried hard enough, if we talked enough, if we worked through it together, we could repair the cracks. I had convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, I could forgive her. But then I'd remember the way she had looked at him, how her eyes had softened, how her voice had warmed. And that warmth wasn't for me. It was for him. I thought about confronting her again, asking her to tell me the truth, to give me some kind of closure. But every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to face what was waiting for me on the other side of that conversation. What if I couldn't handle it? What if the truth shattered everything I had left? I couldn't sleep that night. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with thoughts of her, thoughts of him, thoughts of what my life would look like now. It had been so easy to love her, to believe that everything would work out. But now, the future felt so uncertain. Everything I had built, everything I had worked for, felt like it was crumbling, piece by piece. Around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to talk to her. I needed to hear her voice, to understand what was happening. I didn't care if it would hurt, if it would make everything worse. I just needed to know the truth, no matter how ugly it was. So, I got out of bed, slipped into my jeans, and went downstairs to find her. She was sitting on the couch in the living room, staring blankly at the television. The glow from the screen reflected on her face, making her look like a ghost. It was the first time in days that I'd seen her still, truly still. She hadn't been this quiet in a long time. I had expected her to be sleeping, to be hiding from me, but here she was, waiting for something, anything, to change. I walked into the room, and she turned to face me. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, her expression weary, like she had been waiting for this moment just as much as I had. "Matthew," she said softly, her voice hoarse. She hadn't called me that in days. It felt foreign, distant. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. She nodded, biting her lip. "About what?" "About us," I said, my heart hammering in my chest. "About everything." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she just stared at me, her gaze searching, like she was trying to figure out how to say what we both already knew. "I'm not going to lie to you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been seeing him. For a while now." It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. I hadn't expected it to hit me so hard, but it did. The words echoed in my head, bouncing around like a storm. "I've been seeing him. I didn't want to hurt you," she continued, her voice trembling. "I know I've already hurt you, but I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine when I felt so lost. I didn't know what to say." My mind was still reeling, still processing her words. I had known, on some level, that this was coming. But hearing her say it out loud felt like a slap in the face. "I loved you, Matthew," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "I still do. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. And I couldn't keep living like this, pretending that everything was okay when I was dying inside." There it was. The truth. The raw, painful truth that had been hiding behind every half-hearted apology, every excuse she had made. She wasn't just too tired for me. She wasn't just stressed. She was emotionally absent, checked out, and had found someone else to fill the void. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. I had always believed that love could fix anything, that love was enough to pull us through the hardest times. But now, standing in front of her, I realized how naive that belief had been. Love wasn't enough if one person wasn't willing to fight for it. "I don't know what to say," I finally managed, my voice thick with emotion. "You've made your choice. You've already made it. And I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this." "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said softly. I know I don't deserve it. For the first time in days, I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw the woman I had loved. But I also saw the person she had become, the person who had lied, who had betrayed me, who had kept me in the dark while she had moved on. And I knew, in that moment, that I couldn't keep fighting for someone who didn't want to fight for me. I need to go, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I need space. I can't do this anymore. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks, but she didn't try to stop me. She didn't say anything. She just let me go. I turned and walked toward the door, the weight of her silence pressing down on me with every step. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me like a breath of fresh air. The weight that had been crushing me for weeks was finally lifting. I didn't know what would come next, whether I would ever be able to move on from this, whether I would ever heal, but I knew one thing for sure, I had made my choice. And it was time to let go. The weeks that followed were the hardest I've ever had to endure. The emptiness of the house, once filled with laughter and conversation, now echoed with silence. I tried to fill the void, spending more time at work, calling up old friends, picking up hobbies I had abandoned. But nothing seemed to fit. It was as though I was trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle with pieces that didn't belong. Every room in that house was a reminder of what I had lost. Of who I had lost. But as time passed, I began to realize something. The world hadn't stopped just because my heart had shattered. People still went to work. The sun still rose every morning. Life didn't wait for me to catch up, no matter how badly I wanted it to. It's funny how grief doesn't just take over your heart, it starts to seep into every corner of your existence, coloring the way you see the world. For weeks, I looked at everything through a lens of pain, the colors dulled, the edges blurred. Everything felt wrong. My favorite coffee shop? Too many memories. The street where we used to take walks? Every corner had a story I no longer wanted to remember. I felt like I was drowning in the past, unable to breathe in the present. But I kept telling myself, one day, this will get better. One day, you'll look back and it won't hurt as much. It wasn't easy. There were nights when I still reached for my phone, intending to call her, to ask her how her day was, to ask if she was thinking about me the way I was thinking about her. But every time I held that phone in my hand, the cold reality of what had happened would stop me. She wasn't the same person anymore. She had chosen a different path, and I had to respect that. Even if it killed me. There was one day, about a month after everything had fallen apart, when I went to the park. The one we used to visit all the time. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for. Closure? Peace? A sign that everything would be okay again? But I walked around the park, breathing in the crisp autumn air, and for the first time in a long time, I felt still. Not happy. Not whole. But still. I sat on the same bench we used to sit on, looking out at the trees, the same trees that had stood there through all the years, all the seasons, unchanging. They had endured storms, scorching heat, bitter cold. But they had never stopped growing. Never stopped reaching for the sun. That's when it hit me. I wasn't going to just get over this. I wasn't going to forget her, forget what we had, or pretend that everything was okay. But I could choose to move forward. Slowly, one step at a time, I could find a way to let go of the anger and the pain. I could learn to forgive, not just her, but myself too. I had spent so long trying to fix something that was broken beyond repair. But I didn't have to keep holding on to the shattered pieces. I didn't have to keep trying to rebuild something that had already fallen apart. Maybe the only way forward was to let go entirely and let myself heal. I left the park that day with a new sense of clarity. I didn't know what my future would look like, but I knew I couldn't keep waiting for the past to come back. I had to keep moving forward. Over the next few months, I found myself slowly finding pieces of myself that I had lost. The person I had been before the pain, before the heartache, was still in there somewhere. I could feel it. I started to rediscover the things I loved. I began running again, something I hadn't done in years. I took up reading more, diving into books that made me feel like there was more to the world than just the tiny space I had been trapped in. I reconnected with old friends, people I had pushed away during the years of our relationship. I started making new memories, memories that weren't tainted by the past. And slowly, bit by bit, I found the strength to let go of the story I had been clinging to. It wasn't easy. The days still came when the sadness would wash over me, and I'd find myself lost in thought, wondering where she was, if she was happy, if she missed me the way I missed her. But every time I thought about reaching out, every time I considered calling her, I reminded myself of why I had walked away in the first place. It wasn't out of anger. It wasn't out of hatred. It was because I deserved better. I deserved someone who was fully present, someone who wasn't just looking for a way out when things got hard. And then, just when I thought I was starting to heal, life threw me another curveball. One night, I was at a bar with a friend, just trying to enjoy the evening, when I saw her. She was standing by the door, laughing with a group of people. She looked different. More confident, maybe? More alive? She didn't see me, and for a brief moment, I considered leaving, just walking away and pretending like I hadn't seen her. But something inside me told me that I needed to face this. I needed to see her for who she had become. So, I walked over. Her eyes widened when she saw me, and for a moment, there was that familiar awkwardness between us. But then, she smiled. It wasn't the same smile I remembered, the one that had been full of affection and promise. No, this one was different. It was softer, more subdued, but it still reached her eyes. "Matthew," she said softly. "I didn't think I'd see you here." I nodded, trying to keep my composure. "Yeah, just out with a friend." We stood there for a few moments, the space between us filled with so many unspoken words. And then, without thinking, I said the one thing that had been on my mind all along. "I hope you're happy," I said quietly. "I really do." She looked at me for a long time, her gaze searching, and I could see the pain in her eyes, the same pain I had carried for so long. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For everything. I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," I said, offering a faint smile. "But I've let go. I've forgiven you. And I think that's the most important thing, for both of us." And in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't forgiveness that healed us. It wasn't a magic word or a grand gesture. It was simply this, understanding that sometimes, the best way to love someone is by letting them go. Sometimes, the best way to heal is by accepting that the story you've been holding on to isn't yours to finish. I walked away that night feeling lighter. Not completely healed, but free. Free to move forward, free to embrace whatever came next, free to finally let the past rest. And maybe that was the most beautiful part of all, the peace that comes from knowing that, in the end, it was all just old journey all along.